right. Let's jump right in today. We're going to be taking a trip back to the 1960s.
Oh, the 60s.
We're going to be looking at the revolutionary 1960s, a decade of change that shaped the world.
Okay.
And we're not just going to be like hitting the highlights or anything like that. This deep dive is all about kind of finding some of those more hidden connections and those big moments that still like affect us today.
And it's really interesting how the decade begins because, you'd think with the Cold War still going on, everything would be kind of tense. But the book really highlights this sense of optimism in 1960, a new decade, full of promise. It's almost like you can feel it.
Right. It was like the American dream, just like on overdrive.
Yes.
So many technological advances, the economy was booming. It really did feel like anything was possible. But of course, under the surface, there were some cracks starting to show, especially when it came to civil rights.
Yeah, absolutely. The civil rights movement was, already gaining momentum, but the 60s really became like a crucible for it.
Yeah.
Figures like, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, their leadership was obviously critical.
Right.
But the book also really goes into the kind of strategic brilliance of the movement itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What kind of strategies really stood out to you?
Well, one thing that's highlighted is how they really understood the power of using different tactics. So, you had all the legal battles going on, which eventually led to some huge legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Right.
But at the same time, you also had all the protests, the sit-ins, the boycotts.
Yeah.
Each of those was really carefully planned to disrupt the system and show just how unjust it was.
It wasn't just about changing laws, right? It was about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, what made the movement so powerful. They forced America to really look at its own hypocrisy on a massive scale. But this energy, this desire for equality, it wasn't just limited to racial justice.
Right.
It was happening alongside the rise of feminism, too.
Oh, totally. Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique.
Right.
That book came out in, 1963?
1963, yeah. It was a huge turning point.
It was a bombshell.
It totally shattered the illusion of the happy housewife.
Right.
And really gave a voice to a whole generation of women who wanted more.
Yeah.
And then, just 3 years later, you see the founding of NW, the National Organization for Women. It's like a straight line from ideas to action.
Yeah. So you have this incredible push for social justice on all these different fronts.
Right.
And then in 1964, culture just gets completely jolted from across the pond.
Yes.
The British invasion.
The Beatles arriving in America. It was like this massive cultural event that touched everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fashion, film, humor, it all got like a Beatles-inspired makeover. But what I find so interesting is how they tapped into this youthful sense of rebellion that was already kind of brewing.
Yes. It wasn't just that they were playing catchy songs. It was like they embodied this idea of rejecting the old ways.
Yeah.
And you could feel that energy connecting with young people in America who were looking for ways to express their own desire for change. It's almost like they gave permission to a whole generation to question authority and try something new.
It's like the decade starts to really crackle with energy here.
Yes.
But in the middle of all this cultural and social change, the world almost ended.
Yeah.
1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
13 days that could have literally changed history.
It's crazy to think about.
Kennedy versus Khrushchev, nuclear weapons ready to go. It's hard to imagine a situation with higher stakes.
What I find so fascinating is how that crisis, even though it's terrifying, actually ended up shaping how the Cold War went from there.
Exactly. The book argues that it forced both superpowers to really see the potential consequences of their actions. You know, it led to that period of détente, the easing of relations, and even to setting up that direct hotline between Washington and Moscow.
Wow.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, diplomacy can still win out.
But then, right next to this potential for total destruction,
yeah,
you have this incredible race to space. It feels almost surreal.
And yet they were really connected.
Yeah.
Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon was absolutely driven by Cold War competition.
Right.
It was about projecting American power and showing off their technological advantage.
It was a space race in every sense of the word. The creation of NASA, all the fast progress in rocket technology. It was like science fiction was becoming real.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the Apollo program.
A symbolic victory for the United States in the Cold War, definitely, but also just a testament to human ambition and how clever we can be.
It really captured the imagination of the entire world.
Absolutely. But while everyone was focused on space, there was a different kind of revolution happening down here on Earth, the counterculture movement.
And this wasn't just about, peace signs and tie-dye, was it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The book connects this movement to this deep disillusionment with the Vietnam War and a longing for a way of life that was more genuine, less focused on material things. It was about questioning authority, challenging social norms, and trying to find some kind of spiritual enlightenment.
There's this combination of anxieties about the war, a desire for something more meaningful, and then figures like Allen Ginsberg and Abbie Hoffman emerge as these countercultural icons.
Right. They became the voices of a generation that was rejecting the status quo.
Yeah.
Ginsberg, with his beat poetry, was challenging conformity and fighting for freedom of expression. Hoffman, with his yippie activism, used humor and satire to point out the hypocrisy of the establishment.
Yeah. They weren't just protesting, they were creating a whole new cultural landscape.
Yeah.
And, of course, you can't talk about counterculture without mentioning the music.
Yeah.
Psychedelic rock became like the soundtrack for this generation.
Absolutely. Bands like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Doors, they all provided the backdrop for this cultural revolution.
Yeah.
It was more than just music. It was a reflection of the social and political turmoil going on, a way for young people to express their anxieties, their hopes, and their desire for a different world.
And during all of this swirling change, the decade was also marked by events that would leave a permanent mark on America.
Yeah, for sure. The assassination of JFK in 1963.
Oh, yeah.
That moment really shattered a nation's sense of innocence and cast a long shadow over the rest of the decade.
Yeah. And then just a few months later, you have the March on Washington.
Hundreds of thousands of people coming together demanding civil rights. It was a powerful display of unity and really solidified Martin Luther King Jr.'s place in history with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
A speech that still resonates so powerfully today. It really shows the lasting power of words to inspire hope and demand change.
Absolutely.
And then, near the end of the decade, another event that would spark a movement. The Stonewall riots in 1969.
A pivotal moment for LGBTQ+ rights. This wasn't just a protest, it was an uprising. A marginalized community finally saying enough and fighting back against police harassment and societal discrimination.
And from those riots, a movement for equality was born.
Yeah.
One that is still fighting for recognition and justice today. It's amazing to see how all these threads, social justice, cultural upheaval, political turmoil, they're all woven together in this one decade.
It really is a complex tapestry of change, and we've only just begun to unravel it.
But before we go too deep into all of these cultural and social revolutions, we have to address the big thing that was happening, the Vietnam War.
Right.
It's impossible to understand the 1960s without talking about its impact on American society.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As the war escalated, it wasn't just something happening over there anymore.
Right. It was on the news every night. It was dividing families and communities, and it was fueling a growing anti-war movement here in America.
And it wasn't just students and activists, right? Regular, everyday Americans were starting to question the war and what it was all about.
Exactly. The book really emphasizes how the Vietnam War forced a national discussion about the limits of American power and the complicated morality of war. This wasn't some far-off conflict. It was deeply personal and divisive, shaking people's trust in their government and how it acted in the world. It was a turning point in how many Americans viewed their country and its place on the global stage.
And while that conversation was happening, there was another layer of complexity unfolding, the Black Power movement.
Right. It came out of a growing frustration with how slowly things were changing, a feeling that true equality needed more than just legal desegregation.
Yeah.
This movement was about Black pride, Black self-determination, and Black control over Black communities. And, of course, you can't talk about Black power without talking about the Black Panther Party, a group that was both praised and demonized, right?
Yeah, for sure. They were seen as militant, even dangerous, with their armed patrols of Black neighborhoods and their confrontational approach to police brutality. But they also had a strong focus on community, running free breakfast programs for kids, health clinics, and other important services.
It was a complex movement with a complex legacy, one that people still debate and re-examine today.
Definitely. And it highlights how The fight for racial justice, even within the civil rights movement, had many different sides.
Yeah.
And often involved disagreements about the best way to move forward.
Wow, we've covered so much already, and it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this tumultuous decade.
It's true.
Yeah.
The 1960s were a whirlwind of change, and we still have a lot more to unpack.
Let's take a quick pause here, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to dive deeper into the heart of the 1960s.
You know, it's fascinating to think about how all these huge changes weren't just happening on, like, the national stage, you know?
Yeah.
They were reshaping everyday life for regular people.
That's a good point. It wasn't just happening in Washington or on college campuses. It was changing, like, the fabric of society.
Exactly. The book talks about this, like, cultural metamorphosis, fashion, music, even how people talked about relationships. It all went through this radical transformation. And it's impossible to ignore the role of all these scientific and technological advancements happening at the same time as these social upheavals. We talked about the space race, but there's so much more.
I mean, you think about the development of the birth control pill.
Oh, yeah.
That had to be a game changer.
It absolutely was. It totally revolutionized women's lives, gave them control over their bodies and their reproductive choices in a way they never had before. The ripple effects were huge, influencing everything from family planning to career paths.
It's hard to even grasp the societal impact of that.
Yeah.
So with all these forces, social, political, technological, all swirling around, what was the overall mood? What did it actually feel like to live through this era?
The book paints this really vivid picture of a society that was buzzing with energy, but also really divided. There was this exciting sense of possibility, of breaking free from old constraints, but also this deep undercurrent of uncertainty and anxiety about what the future held.
It seems almost like a paradox, this embracing change while also being afraid of the unknown.
Yeah, that tension, that push and pull between hope and fear is really what defines the 60s.
Yeah.
It was a decade of contradictions, a time of progress and backlash, of idealism kind of smashing up against reality.
And speaking of clashes, the book also goes into the Watts riots in 1965.
Oh, right.
Even with all that landmark civil rights legislation passed, it seems like tensions were still bubbling under the surface.
Absolutely. The Watts riots were this tragic explosion of frustration and anger. They were a stark reminder that just because laws changed, that didn't automatically mean that everyone experienced equality in their lives.
Yeah.
The riots exposed these deep-seated inequalities and racial tensions that were still woven into the fabric of American society.
It was a brutal wake-up call, showing that the fight for racial justice was nowhere near finished.
Exactly. It highlighted that real change needed more than just laws written down on paper.
Yeah.
It needed a fundamental shift in attitudes, opportunities, and in the power structures themselves.
And then, in almost stark contrast, just a couple of years later, you have the Summer of Love in San Francisco.
Oh, yes. That legendary gathering in Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah.
Thousands of young people just flocked there, embracing peace, love, and free expression.
Yeah.
The images they're iconic, you know, flowers in their hair, vibrant colors, a soundtrack of psychedelic rock.
It almost feels like a direct response to the Watts riots, this yearning for a more harmonious world.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection there, a desire to counter all that negativity and violence with this message of love and unity.
Right.
But the Summer of Love also had its own contradiction.
Oh, in what way?
Well, it was a time of incredible idealism, but also a time of, well, naivete. The realities of drugs, poverty, and disillusionment eventually set in, showing how fragile even the most utopian dreams can be.
It kind of highlights the complexities of social movements, doesn't it? How difficult it is to take these ideals and turn them into lasting change.
Definitely. It's a cautionary tale reminding us that good intentions aren't enough.
Right.
Transforming society takes sustained effort, strategic action, and a willingness to face the complicated nature of humans and systemic issues.
And as the decade went on, those complexities just seemed to intensify.
Yeah.
In 1968, we see another devastating loss, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy.
Another tragic loss, and it felt especially cruel so soon after his brother's assassination. It was a blow to those who saw him as a symbol of hope for social progress and political reform.
And just a few months later, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago descends into chaos.
Yeah, the book portrays it as like a mini version of all the tensions and divisions tearing the nation apart.
Yeah.
You had anti-war protesters clashing with police, the Democratic Party struggling with its own internal splits, and this pervasive feeling that the American dream was falling apart.
It's hard to believe how much turmoil happened in just 1 year.
I know.
1968 was really pivotal, not just for the 60s, but for the entire course of American history.
I totally agree. And then in 1969, you have these two monumental events that in many ways sum up the spirit of the decade: the moon landing and the Stonewall riots.
Wow, it's almost like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this triumph of human ingenuity and technology,
Right.
and on the other, this powerful act of defiance against oppression and discrimination.
Exactly. The moon landing was a landmark achievement, showing just how far human ambition and scientific exploration could go.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how people even process this incredible feat at a time when there was so much turmoil and change happening here on Earth.
I think for many people, it was a source of both inspiration and dissonance. Here was this incredible display of human potential, and yet there were still so many problems that hadn't been solved here at home.
It's like looking up at the stars and realizing how far we've come as a species, but also how much further we have to go in terms of social justice and equality.
That's a really profound observation.
Thanks.
And then, right next to this giant leap for mankind, you have the Stonewall riots, a moment that ignited a movement for LGBTQ plus rights that is still shaping our world today.
Yeah, it was a turning point, a moment when a marginalized community refused to be silent and stood up to demand their rightful place in society.
And it's fascinating to think about how both the moon landing and the Stonewall riots were, each in their own way, about pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo.
Wow.
One expanded the frontiers of human exploration, while the other fought to expand human rights.
What a powerful way to put it.
It speaks to the many different facets of progress,
Yeah.
and the different ways that individuals and communities can work towards a better future.
We've traveled through this turbulent and transformative decade, from the optimism of 1960 to the upheaval of 1969.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, it really has.
But we're not quite done yet.
Okay,
There's still one really important question to address.
what's that?
What lasting impact did this decade have? How did the events and movements of the 1960s shape the world we live in today?
That's a question we'll explore in our final segment. Stay with us. We've seen the highs and lows of the 1960s, the triumphs and tragedies, the moments that shook the world. But as we wrap up our deep dive into this revolutionary decade, it's time to really think about its lasting impact. You know, what echoes of the 60s are still, like, around today.
It's amazing to see how many issues we're dealing with now actually have their roots back then.
Yeah.
The book really drives home the point that the 1960s weren't just a time of change, they were like a catalyst for long-term transformation.
Right.
Take the civil rights movement, for example.
Yeah, you really can't overstate how important those legal